The Galactic Assembly had watched humanity for 300 years, and in all that time, they had seen nothing that impressed them or made them worry about the small species living on a blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. The Assembly was old and powerful, and it contained 17,000 different civilizations that had spread across millions of star systems over countless generations, and they had rules and traditions that went back to times before most species had even learned to walk upright on their home worlds. When Ambassador Kethfral of the Velfari Dominion stood before the Great Council and proposed what he called a controlled integration of humanity into the galactic order, there was not a single voice raised in opposition, because everyone in that massive hall believed the same thing about the humans. They were weak and they were primitive, and they had barely managed to leave their own planet, and they would make excellent workers in the mining colonies of the outer territories, where labor was always needed and where life was hard and short. The vote was unanimous, and the order was given, and the bull Velthari fleet of 200 warships began its journey toward the small yellow star that the humans called Sol. Fleet Commander Thros stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and he looked at the tactical displays showing the human system growing larger as they approached, and he felt nothing but boredom, because this was not a real mission in his mind. This was simply a collection, run like picking up cargo from a station. And he had done hundreds of such missions in his long career, and he expected this one to be finished within a single rotation of the human homeworld. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, and immediately began scanning for any signs of resistance or military activity. And what they found confused them greatly. Earth's orbital defense grid was dark and silent, and there were no warships moving to intercept them, and there were no warning signals being broadcast, and there was nothing at all that suggested the humans even knew they were coming. Thros made a sound of disgust and turned to his communications officer and ordered him to broadcast the standard annexation terms to the human government, and he did not even bother to sit in his command chair because he assumed this would be over quickly. The message went out across all frequencies, and it was simple and direct. And it told the humans that they had one rotation to surrender unconditionally or face the complete destruction of their civilization and their absorption into the Dominion as a slave species. The bridge crew waited for a response, and minutes passed, and then hours, and still there was nothing but silence from the blue planet hanging in the darkness ahead of them. Thros was about to order a demonstration strike on one of the human outer colonies when his sensor officer made a strange sound and called for his attention with fear clearly present in his voice. Commander, there is something wrong with our readings, the officer said, and his hands were shaking as he worked his console. Thros walked over and looked at the display, and what he saw made no sense to him at all, because the instruments were showing energy signatures coming from behind the largest planet in the system, and those signatures were impossible. They were reading dark matter manipulation on a scale that should not exist, and they were reading gravitational distortions that bent space itself, and they were reading power outputs that exceeded anything the Velthari had ever encountered in their entire history of space travel. What is this? Thros demanded, and his voice had lost its bored tone and was now sharp with something that might have been the beginning of real fear before anyone could answer him. The impossible readings moved, and something emerged from behind the gas giant that the humans called Jupiter, and Thros felt his blood turn cold as he watched it come into view. It was a ship, but it was unlike any ship he had ever seen, because it did not seem to move through space in the normal way, but instead seemed to pull space toward itself and push it away, and the stars behind it twisted and warped as it approached. The vessel was massive and black and covered in patterns that hurt his eyes to look at directly, and it gave off readings that his instruments simply could not process or understand. Humanity had never been primitive, and Thros understood this now with a terrible clarity that made his legs feel weak beneath him. They had been patient, and they had been clever, And they had been hiding and watching and waiting for exactly this moment when someone would come to try and take what was theirs. For 200 years, while the assembly had watched their decoy civilization stumble through basic fusion power and primitive space stations, the real humans had been doing something else entirely. They had been mining dark matter from the cosmic web itself, and they had been building ships that could reshape reality around themselves, and they had been preparing for the day when the galaxy would finally notice them and try to make them kneel. The vessel that emerged from Jupiter's shadow was called the Prometheus, and it was the first of the Erebus-class warships, and it was commanded by a woman named Captain Yuki Tanaka, who had waited her entire life for this moment. She stood on her bridge and looked at the Valkyrie fleet on her display, and she felt no anger or hatred toward them because they were simply doing what every other species in the galaxy had done throughout history. They were trying to take from others because they were strong, and they thought strength was all that mattered, and they have never encountered anything that challenged that belief until now. Tanaka gave a simple order, and its Prometheus generated its first combat shockwave, and the energy pulse traveled outward through the dark matter substrate that connected all of space, and it struck the Valkyrie flagship with perfect precision. Thros did not even have time to give an order or to call for help or to understand what was happening, because in one instant his ship existed, and in the next instant it simply did not. The gravitational forces that hit the Eternal Dominion were beyond anything that normal matter could withstand, and the vessel was torn apart at the molecular level and scattered across 1,000,000 kilometers of space in less than a heartbeat. The rest of the Valkyrie fleet watched in horror as their flagship vanished, and then they watched as the dark human ship turned its attention toward them, and they understood finally and completely that they had made a terrible mistake. Some of them tried to run, and some of them tried to fight, and some of them simply sat frozen at their stations, unable to move or think or do anything at all. It did not matter what they chose, because the outcome was the same for all of them. Shockwaves came one after another, and each one found its target with impossible accuracy, and each one erased a Valkyrie warship from existence, as if it had never been there at all. The entire battle lasted less than 4 minutes, and when it was over, there was nothing left of the fleet that had come to conquer humanity except expanding clouds of debris and the echoes of energy readings that would confuse scientists across the galaxy for years to come. Captain Tanaka looked at the empty space where 200 enemy ships had been, and she took a deep breath, and she gave the order to broadcast a message to any surviving Valkyrie vessels that might be monitoring from outside the system. The message was simple, and it would be heard across the galaxy within days, and it would change everything that every species believed about humanity and their place in the cosmic order. You came to take our freedom, and instead you have learned the truth about who we really are and what we can really do, and now you will go back to your assembly and you will tell them what happened here. Today, tell them that humanity is not primitive, and tell them that humanity is not weak, and tell them that if anyone else comes to our system with hostile intent, they will meet the same fate as your fleet. Tell them that we have 17 more ships like this one, and tell them that we have been preparing for this moment for 200 years, and tell them that we are done hiding. The message ended, and the Prometheus turned and began its journey back toward Earth, where the other Erebus-class warships waited in formation above the planet that humanity had called home for so long. The galaxy would never look at the small blue world the same way again, and the balance of power that had existed for millions of years was about to be shattered by a species that everyone had underestimated. Age of human patience was over, and the age of human power had begun. The news of the Valkyrie fleet's complete destruction reached the assembly hall on Nexus Prime within hours, and it spread like fire through dry grass across the 10,000 worlds that made up the galactic civilization. High Chancellor Morvith was an ancient being from a species called the Kethari, and he had held his position for over 300 years, and in all that time he had never received news that disturbed him as much as what he was hearing now. He stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded by holographic displays showing the sensor data from the Sol system, and he demanded answers from his military advisors, but none of them could give him what he wanted because none of them understood what they were looking at. The readings made no sense to anyone who studied them because the human ships had done something that should have been impossible according to every law of physics that the galaxy had ever discovered. They had generated localized space-time distortions, and they had turned those distortions into weapons, and those weapons had propagated through the dark matter scaffolding that existed beneath all of normal space. Like a hidden skeleton holding the universe together, the shockwaves had not simply destroyed the Veltari ships, but had erased them from existence by tearing apart the very fabric of reality around them. And there was no known defense against such an attack. Admiral Keth of the Assembly Defense Force was one of the most respected military minds in the galaxy, and even he could not explain how the humans had developed such technology, or how anyone could hope to fight against I. Stood before the council and admitted his complete confusion, and his voice was heavy with shame. As he spoke, "We have nothing that can counter this," he said, "and we have no weapons that can match this, and we have no shields that can protect against this, and if the humans decide to attack us, we will not be able to stop them." The hall erupted in chaos as representatives from thousands of worlds shouted and screamed and demanded action and demanded protection and demanded that someone do something to save them from this new and terrible threat. Chancellor Morvith raised his hand for silence, and slowly the noise died down, and everyone turned to look at him, waiting for wisdom and guidance from their ancient leader. Before he could speak, a new signal came through the communication systems, and a human face appeared on every display in the hall, and her name was Admiral Helena Vasquez, and she was the commander of Earth's new space fleet. She was not young, and her hair was gray, and her face was lined with years of experience and responsibility. And when she looked out at the assembled representatives of the galaxy, her eyes were calm and steady and showed no fear. At Ali, "I'm speaking to you today because I want you to understand what happened in our system, and I want you to understand what it means for the future of this galaxy," she said. Her voice was clear and strong, and it carried across light years through the quantum relay network, and it reached every world that had a receiver capable of picking up the signal. Humanity possesses 17 Erebus-class dreadnoughts, she continued, and each one of these vessels is capable of generating shockwaves that can be detected across 100 light years of space. Paused and let that information sink in, and she watched the reactions on the faces of the alien beings staring back at her through their own displays. "Your military doctrine is built on plasma lances and kinetic bombardment, and these weapons are effective against each other, but they are useless against us," she said. "Technology you have relied upon for millions of years is now obsolete, and there is nothing you can do to change this fact, no matter how many ships you build or how many alliances you form." The hall was silent now, and every being present was listening with complete attention because they understood that their entire way of life was being challenged by this gray-haired human woman speaking from a world they had dismissed as primitive. Admiral Vasquez continued speaking, and she told them about the 200 years of hidden development, and she told them about the dark matter mining operations that humanity had conducted in secret, and she told them about the physics breakthrough that had made everything possible. She did not boast or threaten because she did not need to, and the simple facts she presented were more frightening than any threat could have been. When she finished speaking, she asked if there were any questions, and Chancellor Morvith stepped forward and asked the one thing that everyone in the hall wanted to know. "What do you want from us?" he asked, and his voice was tired and afraid, and he sounded like a being who had lived too long and seen too much. Admiral Vasquez smiled slightly, and her answer was unexpected because she said that humanity wanted only one thing, and that thing was very simple. We want to be left alone, she said, and we want to develop our civilization in peace. And we want to explore the galaxy on our own terms without interference from anyone. We did not ask for your attention, and we did not want your attention. And when you sent a fleet to enslave us, you forced us to reveal what we had built. The message was clear, and it was reasonable, and it should have been easy for the assembly to accept, but the galaxy did not work that way, and there were too many beings with too much power who could not accept a new order without fighting against it. The collective of minds was a hive species that had dominated galactic politics for thousands of years, and they were not willing to simply step aside because one small species had developed impressive weapons. They began reaching out to other civilizations, and they began forming alliances, and they began planning for war because they believed that numbers would eventually overcome any technological advantage. 300 different species pledged their ships to the cause, and the fleet they assembled was called the Armada of Unity, and it numbered over 50,000 vessels, and it was the largest military force gathered since the ancient Silence Wars. The preparations took months, and during that time humanity watched and waited, and did not interfere because they wanted the galaxy to understand something important. Admiral Vasquez released a single document to the assembly, and the document contained the technical specifications of humanity's smallest patrol craft, and this vessel was not even close to being as powerful as the Erebus-class ships. The strategists of the Armada studied the document for 6 days, and they ran simulations, and they calculated probabilities, and they consulted with the greatest minds available to them. At the end of those 6 days, they called a meeting of all the species involved in the coalition, and they presented their findings, and their recommendation was immediate and complete disbandment of the Armada. The patrol craft described in the human documents was capable of destroying an entire fleet by itself, and the Armada would not even be able to get within weapons range before they were all eliminated one by one. The species began withdrawing their ships and their support, and the Great Coalition fell apart without a single shot being fired because everyone finally understood what Admiral Vasquez had been trying to tell them. The age of galactic empires built on military conquest was over, and a new era was beginning, and humanity would be at the center of whatever came next. Chancellor Morvith stood alone in the empty assembly hall after everyone else had left, and he looked at the stars through the great windows, and he wondered what the future would hold for his people and for all the peoples of the galaxy. He had spent 300 years believing that he understood how the universe worked, and now he knew that he had been wrong about everything. And the knowledge was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the human warships waited and watched, and the shockwaves they could generate had already torn through the old order of the galaxy, even before they had been fired in anger again. The Volturi Dominion had paid the price for underestimating humanity, and now the rest of the galaxy had to decide what they would do with the lesson that sacrifice had taught them. Some would choose wisdom, and some would choose foolishness, and the consequences of those choices would shape the future of every living being for generations to come. The shockwave doctrine had been established, and nothing would ever be the same again. Panic spread through the galactic community like a disease that infected every world and every species and every government, and there was no cure for it because the fear was based on something real and undeniable. Species that had spent countless generations building empires and conquering territory and accumulating power now faced a question that none of them had ever considered before, and that question was simple but devastating. What was their place in a galaxy where a single human warship could shatter the core of a planet with a focused gravitational pulse, and where no fleet could stand against that power, no matter how large it was? The old ways of thinking did not work anymore, and the old alliances did not matter anymore, and the old rules that had governed galactic civilization for millions of years were suddenly worthless. different. Species responded to this new reality in different ways, and some of those responses were wise and some were foolish and some were simply desperate attempts to hold on to power that was already slipping away. The Kreth hegemony was one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy, and they had survived by always choosing the winning side in every conflict, and they looked at humanity and saw which way the wind was blowing. Their ambassador traveled to Earth, and he brought with him an offer that he believed would please the humans and secure his people's future in the new galactic order. He offered humanity exclusive mining rights to 3 resource-rich systems, and he offered trade agreements, and he offered technology that the Kreth had developed over millions of years. The human diplomats listened politely to everything he said, and then they declined every single offer. And they did so without anger or insult, but with a firm certainty that confused the Kreth ambassador completely. We do not want your resources, and we do not need your technology, and we do not seek your submission. One of the human diplomats said, "We only want to be left in peace, and that is all we have ever wanted." The Kreth ambassador returned to his home world without an agreement, and he reported to his government that the humans were unlike any species he had ever encountered. They had absolute power, and they were choosing not to use it to dominate others. And this behavior made no sense to beings who had always believed that power existed only to be used. The Solaran theocracy took a different approach to the new reality, and their approach was to deny that reality and create a new one that fit their beliefs better. The Solarans were a deeply religious species, and they believed that their gods controlled the fate of the universe. And when they learned about the human warships, they decided that this was divine intervention. They declared that humans were agents of punishment sent by the gods to cleanse the galaxy of sin, and they began preaching that the Assembly's destruction was proof of cosmic justice. Their priests traveled to other worlds spreading this message, and they found many beings who wanted to believe that there was meaning behind what had happened and that the universe still made sense. But the humans refused to play the role that they Solarans had assigned to them, and they made it clear that they were not divine beings and they were not messengers from any god. This confused the Solarans, but they simply adjusted their theology and decided that the humans were humble servants who did not know their own divine purpose, and they continued worshipping them anyway. The mercantile Fen were more practical than either the Kreth or the Solarans, and they saw opportunity where others saw only fear and destruction. The Fen had built their civilization on trade, and they had always found ways to profit from every situation, no matter how difficult, and they looked at humanity and saw the ultimate trading partner. They abandoned their traditional neutrality and began secretly reaching out to human traders, and they offered goods and services and information in exchange for anything the humans might be willing to share. The Fen did not expect to receive dark matter technology because they were not foolish enough to think humanity would share such power, but they hoped for scraps and fragments that might give them advantages over their competitors. Some human merchants began doing business with the Fen, and the trade was limited at first, but it grew steadily, and the Fen became wealthy from selling human goods to other species who were desperate for any connection to the new power within the Assembly. All itself, the great coalition that had governed the galaxy, was falling apart piece by piece, and the collapse was happening faster than anyone had predicted. Chancellor Morvith faced a vote of no confidence from dozens of species who blamed him for the current crisis, and the vote failed, but only barely, and his authority was permanently damaged. Then came the leak that destroyed what little trust remained in the Assembly leadership's secret communications were released to the public, and those communications revealed that the Assembly had known about Earth's hidden development programs for decades and had dismissed the intelligence as fabrication. Spies had reported the truth about humanity's real technological level, and analysts had warned that the humans were far more advanced than they appeared, but no one in power had believed them reports. They had been so certain that they understood humanity and so confident in their own superiority that they had ignored every warning sign and every piece of evidence that contradicted their assumptions. The leak caused outrage across the galaxy because it proved that the assembly leadership had failed in their most basic responsibility, which was to protect the civilizations they governed. Species that had trusted the assembly began questioning everything, and old grievances resurfaced, and the unity that had held the galactic civilization together began to crack and splinter. The Velthari Dominion announced their complete withdrawal from galactic politics, and their ambassador delivered a final speech that was filled with grief and anger and shame. "We sent our sons and daughters to die because we believed what we were told about humanity," he said, "and we trusted our leaders, and our leaders failed. US and now our fleet is dust, and our faith is broken." The Dominion ships that had survived by not being part of the attack fleet returned to their home systems, and they closed their borders, and they refused all contact with other species. They had been humiliated in front of the entire galaxy, and they needed time to heal, and to rebuild, and to decide what kind of people they wanted to be in this new era. While all of this chaos unfolded, humanity remained calm and quiet, and they made no demands, and they claimed no territory, and they simply established a single embassy on Nexus Prime. The embassy was small, and it was staffed by only a handful of diplomats, and it was located in a modest building that was nothing special compared to the grand structures around it. And Ambassador Chen Wei was the head of this embassy, and she was a patient woman who had spent her career studying alien cultures and preparing for this moment. Every day representatives from different species came to her office, and they made offers, and they made threats, and they begged, and they pleaded, and she declined everything. With the same polite smile, when they asked what humanity wanted, she always gave the same answer, and that answer never changed no matter how many times she repeated it. "We want to be left alone," she would say, and we thought that was clear after what happened to the Velthari fleet. The visitors would leave frustrated and confused, and they would report to their governments that the humans were impossible to understand and impossible to predict. Some species believed that humanity was planning something, and that their quiet patience was just the calm before a storm of conquest and destruction. Others believed that the humans truly meant what they said, and that they simply wanted peace. But this seemed too good to be true, and so these species remained suspicious and watchful. The truth was something that few beings in the galaxy could comprehend, because it went against everything they had been taught about power and civilization. Humanity had built the most devastating weapons in the history of the universe, and they had no intention of using those weapons to rule over anyone or to take anything from anyone. They had been forced to reveal their strength because the galaxy had tried to enslave them. But now that their strength was known, they wanted only to return to their quiet existence. The shockwaves from their warships had torn through the fabric of galactic politics just as effectively as they had torn through the Velthari fleet, and the assembly would never recover from either blow. A new order was coming, and no one knew what shape it would take, but everyone knew that humanity would be at its center, whether they wanted to be or not. The age of the old empires was ending, and something new was being born in the chaos they had left behind. Not every species in the galaxy was willing to accept the new order that humanity's emergence had created, and some of them refused to believe that they had no options left. A convergence of wrath was formed in secret by 12 militant species who had built their entire civilizations on the principles of warfare and conquest, and who could not imagine existing in a galaxy where they were not the predators at the top. These species had little in common with each other, and under normal circumstances they would have been enemies, but their shared hatred of human supremacy brought them together. They met on a remote station far from any inhabited world, and they made plans, and they gathered resources, and they convinced themselves that they had found a weakness in the human defense. Their reasoning was simple, and it was based on what they believed they knew about human psychology and human emotions. If they could strike at the humans in a way that caused personal loss and grief, then the humans would respond with anger, and they would be drawn into a ground war where numbers and experience might matter. The Erebus-class warships were powerful beyond imagination, but they were few in number, and they could not be everywhere at once, and they could not occupy planets or fight in cities. If the convergence could force humanity to fight on their terms, then perhaps the outcome would be different, and perhaps the old ways could be restored. The target they chose was the human embassy on Nexus Prime, and the attack was planned with careful precision over many months. They gathered intelligence about the embassy's defenses and its schedule and the movements of its staff, and they identified the perfect moment to strike, when all of the human diplomats would be inside the building. The attack force consisted of 2,000 elite soldiers from across the 12 species, and they were equipped with the best weapons and armor available, and they were absolutely committed to their mission. On the day of the attack, they moved into position around the embassy, and they waited for the signal, and they believed that they were about to change the course of galactic history. What they did not know was that humanity had been watching them from the very beginning. Human intelligence networks operated through the dark matter substrate that connected all of space, and they used quantum communication methods that were impossible to detect or intercept. The convergence's plans had been known to human analysts before the conspirators had even finalized them, and every meeting and every message and every preparation had been observed and recorded. Ambassador Chen Wei received the warning 90 seconds before the attack was scheduled to begin, and she calmly ordered her staff to evacuate through a hidden passage that the attackers did not know existed. The diplomats emerged from a building 3 blocks away, and they were picked up by a shuttle, and they were in orbit before the first shot was fired. The convergence soldiers stormed an empty building, and they found nothing but abandoned desks and blank screens, and the realization of what this meant filled them with dread. If the humans had known about the attack, then the humans had allowed it to proceed. And if the humans had allowed it to proceed, then the humans had a reason. That reason became clear when sensor operators across Nexus Prime detected a massive energy signature entering the system, and the readings matched the profile of an Erebus-class warship. The Prometheus had returned. Captain Yuki Tanaka stood on her bridge, and she looked at the displays showing the chaos unfolding on the planet below, and she felt something that might have been pity for the beings who had made such a terrible miscalculation. She broadcasted a single message to everyone in the system, and the message was simple: observe. The Prometheus moved to the gravitational center of the Nexus system, and it positioned itself with perfect precision, and then it did something that no one had ever seen before. The great ship generated a controlled shockwave, but this shockwave was not a weapon in the usual sense, because it was not designed to destroy. Instead, it was calibrated to demonstrate what destruction could look like without actually causing death. The pulse propagated outward through the dark matter substrate, and it touched every ship and every station and every orbital platform in the system, and for one terrible moment, every vessel experienced a complete loss of inertial dampening. Thousands of ships tumbled out of control as their artificial gravity failed, and their pilots were thrown from their seats, and their cargo shifted, and their systems screamed warnings. Stations that had been in stable orbits suddenly lurched, and their inhabitants were tossed against walls and ceilings, and their power grids flickered, and their life support stuttered on Nexus Prime itself. The building swayed as the planet's orbital path was briefly disturbed, and millions of beings fell to the ground as the world shifted beneath their feet. And then it was over. The shockwave passed, and the ships regained control, and the station stabilized, and the planet continued on its path, and everyone realized that they were still alive. Not a single being had died. That was the point. Captain Tanaka sent a second message, and this one was longer, and it was addressed specifically to the convergence of wrath you attacked. Our embassy because you believed you could provoke us into a war that you could win. She said, you believed that if you caused us pain, we would respond with anger, and we would make mistakes, and we would give you a chance to defeat us. You were wrong. About everything, we knew about your plans from the moment you began making them, and we could have stopped you at any point, but we chose to let you proceed because we wanted to teach you something important. What you just experienced was a fraction of what our ships can do, and we could have destroyed every vessel in this system and shattered this planet into pieces. But we chose not to do that. We could have collapsed this star and turned this entire system into a graveyard, but we chose not to do that. Remember this moment and remember what we chose not to do and understand what it means. The Convergence soldiers on the surface of Nexus Prime dropped their weapons and surrendered to the local authorities, and they did not resist or fight, because they understood now the resistance was meaningless. Their leaders on the remote station where they had planned the attack watched the events unfold, and they knew that their coalition was finished before it had truly begun. Some of them tried to flee to distant systems where they hoped they might hide from human attention, but there was nowhere in the galaxy that the dark matter networks could not reach. Others simply accepted their fate and waited for whatever consequences would come. And they hoped that humanity's mercy would extend to them as it had extended to the beings in the bays. Nexus System Captain Tanaka made one final broadcast before the Prometheus departed, and her words would be remembered for generations. We are not conquerors, and we are not destroyers, and we do not want to rule over anyone or take anything from anyone, she said, but we will not allow others to attack us or threaten us or harm our people, and if you force us to respond, we will respond with everything we have today. We showed you restraint, and we showed you mercy, and we hope that you will learn from this lesson. If you make us teach this lesson again, we will not be so gentle. The Prometheus turned away from Nexus Prime, and it began its journey back toward Earth, and behind it, the galaxy was forever changed by what had happened. The Convergence of Wrath dissolved within days as its member species abandoned the coalition and returned to their home worlds to reconsider their place in the new order. The attack on the embassy had been meant to demonstrate human weakness, but instead it had demonstrated human strength and human restraint, and both of those things were terrifying in their own way. Species across the galaxy debated what the demonstration meant, and some believed it proved that humanity was merciful and could be trusted. Others believed it proved that humanity was playing a game, and that the restraint was temporary, and that eventually, destruction would come. The truth was simpler than either interpretation suggested. Humanity had spent 200 years preparing for this moment, and they had thought carefully about what kind of power they wanted to have and what kind of civilization they wanted to build. They had decided that strength without wisdom was worthless, and that power without restraint was dangerous, and that the ability to destroy meant nothing if it was not balanced by the choice not to destroy. The shockwave that had shaken the Nexus system was a message written in physics and gravity, and the message was clear to anyone willing to understand it. Humanity could have ended everything, and instead they had chosen to spare everyone, and that choice said more about who they were than any words could have expressed. The demonstration was over, but its echoes would ripple through galactic politics for years to come, and nothing would ever be quite the same as it had been before. 5 years had passed since the day when the Vulthury fleet was destroyed, and in that time, the galaxy had transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had lived in the old order. The Galactic Assembly no longer existed in any meaningful sense, because the great coalition that had governed thousands of worlds for millions of years had collapsed under the weight of its own failures and contradictions. In its place rose something new called the Compact of Sovereign Worlds, and this organization was built on principles that were fundamentally different from anything that had come before. The old assembly had been based on hierarchy and power, and the strong had dominated the weak. And that was simply how things worked, and no one questioned it. The compact was based on equality and respect, and the principle that no species had the right to subjugate another, no matter how powerful they were or how weak their target was. Humanity had insisted on only this single condition when they agreed to participate in the new order, and they had made it clear that this condition was not negotiable. Any species that joined the compact had to agree to never attempt to conquer or enslave another species, and violations of this agreement would be met with consequences that no one wanted to experience. The irony of this arrangement was not lost on the historians and philosophers who studied the emergence of the new galactic civilization. Humanity possessed the most devastating military technology ever developed, and they had used that technology to enforce peace rather than to impose their will there. Warships patrolled the major trade routes, and they responded to distress calls, and they investigated reports of aggression, and they did all of this not as conquerors, but as guardians. The shockwave doctrine had become something that no one had expected, and it had become a guarantee of safety for the weak against the strong species that had spent their entire histories being exploited and abused, now found themselves protected by the same power that had terrified them. When it first emerged, the Fen merchants traveled freely through space that had once been too dangerous for them to enter, and their profits grew and their influence expanded. Kreth hegemony discovered that their talent for diplomacy was more valuable in the new order than their talent for choosing sides. Had been in the old one, the Solarians continued their religious worship of humanity, but they also began developing new philosophies about the nature of power and mercy and justice even. The Velthari Dominion eventually emerged from their isolation, and they joined the Compact as a founding member, and they dedicated themselves to building a new identity based on wisdom rather than conquest. The Assembly Hall on Nexus Prime was transformed into the headquarters of the Compact, and the first official gathering of the new organization brought representatives from over 20,000 worlds. Ambassador Chen Wei had been chosen to represent humanity at this historic event, and she stood before the assembled delegates knowing that her words would be recorded and remembered for as long as galactic civilization existed. She was older now than she had been when she first took charge of the embassy, and her hair had turned completely white, and her face showed the marks of years spent navigating impossible situations, but her eyes were still sharp and her voice was still strong, and she spoke with the confidence of someone who had helped shape history. She talked about Earth's past, and she did not hide the darkness that humanity had experienced over the long centuries of their development. She spoke of wars that had killed millions, and she spoke of genocides that had erased entire peoples, and she spoke of empires that had risen and fallen, leaving only ruins and regrets behind. She spoke of the slow and painful climb that humanity had made towards something better, and she admitted that they had not always succeeded, and that they had often failed in terrible ways. We built these ships because we knew what the galaxy was, she said, and we understood that strength was the only language that some beings would ever understand. We watched you for 300 years before you noticed us, and we saw how you treated each other, and we saw how you treated species that were weaker than you. We knew that if we revealed ourselves without the ability to defend ourselves, we would be enslaved or destroyed, and so we hid, and we prepared, and we waited. But we also knew that strength alone means nothing, and that the ability to destroy is worthless if it is not guided by wisdom and restraint. What matters is not what you can do, but what you choose to do, and we chose to use our power to protect rather than to conquer. The delegates listened in silence, and many of them felt emotions that were difficult to describe because they were hearing a truth that challenged everything they had believed about power and civilization. Ambassador Chen Wei continued speaking, and she laid out the vision that humanity had for the future of the galaxy. It was not a vision of human domination or human rule, but a vision of cooperation and mutual respect and shared prosperity. Spoke of trade, networks that would benefit all species equally, and she spoke of scientific collaborations that would advance knowledge for everyone. She spoke of cultural exchanges that would help different species understand each other, and she spoke of conflict resolution mechanisms that would prevent wars. Before they could begin, she spoke of a galaxy where no species would ever again have to fear being conquered or enslaved, and where the strong would protect the weak instead of exploiting them. This is what we offer, she said, and this is what we believe is possible, and this is what we will work toward with every resource at our disposal. But we cannot build this future alone, and we cannot force it to happen, and we can only invite you to join us in creating something that has never existed before. The choice is yours, and it will always be yours, because that is the foundation of everything we are trying to build. When she finished speaking, there was a long moment of silence, and then the applause began, and it grew, and it spread until the entire hall was filled with the sound of thousands of beings expressing their hope and their gratitude. Not everyone was convinced, and not everyone believed that humanity's intentions were genuine, but enough species chose to trust, and enough species chose to participate, and the compact of sovereign worlds became a reality. Over the years that followed, the new organization grew stronger and more stable, and the old patterns of conquest and exploitation began to fade from galactic politics. There were challenges, and there were setbacks, and there were moments when it seemed like the whole experiment might fail, but humanity remained committed to the vision they had presented. The Erebus class warships continued their patrols, and their presence served as a constant reminder that the new order was backed by power that no one could challenge. But they were not used as instruments of domination, and their crews conducted themselves with professionalism and restraint, and they earned the respect of beings across the galaxy. Shockwaves that had once torn through the Velthari fleet now served a different purpose, and they protected the peace that humanity had helped create. Decades passed, and generations came and went, and the memory of the old assembly faded into history. Young beings learned about the ancient times when the strong preyed upon the weak, and they found it difficult to understand how such a galaxy could have existed. They grew up in a civilization where all species were equal, and where conflict was rare, and where the future seemed bright and full of possibility. The dark matter warships still hung in orbit above distant worlds, and their impossible geometries still bent the light of foreign stars. They had become something different from what they had been at the beginning, and they had become symbols not of human aggression, but of galactic hope. Ambassador Chen Wei lived long enough to see the compact celebrate its 50th anniversary, and she delivered a final speech that was broadcast to every world in the organization. She was very old by then, and her voice was weak, but her words carried the weight of everything she had experienced and everything she had helped accomplish. We came to this galaxy as strangers, and we were feared and mistrusted, and some of you hated us for what we represented, she said. But we never stopped believing that something better was possible, and we never stopped working toward the future we had imagined. Today, I look out at a galaxy that is at peace, and I see species that were once enemies now working together as friends. I see trade routes that connect thousands of worlds, and I see knowledge being shared across distances that would have seemed impossible to our ancestors. See hope, and I see progress, and I see the proof that even the darkest times can give way to light if we are willing to work for it. This is what humanity wanted all along, and this is what we fought for, and this is what we will continue to protect for as long as our civilization exists. The shockwaves that our ships can generate will never tear through another fleet in anger, because we have found something better than conquest. We have found partnership, and we have found peace, and we have found our place in a galaxy that is finally learning what those words truly mean. The applause that followed her final words lasted for hours, and beings across the galaxy celebrated what they had built together. Age of human patience had given way to the age of human partnership and the dark matter. Warships that had once terrified the galaxy had become its greatest protectors. The shockwaves had torn through the old order, and in its place, something beautiful had grown, and the future stretched out before them full of possibility.